two amazing. Oh, good job remembering to record. So today, in our topic on the Canadian context in Indigenous-led land planning, we have two amazing speakers that we are extremely honored and excited to have here, Stanley Majutli and Eli Enns. And I will introduce both of them. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Liana Hefner. I'm part of this amazing team that's put together this course. You've heard from Carrie Stevens, Chiskuk, Crystal Leonetti. We've got behind the scenes Hannah Marie, and I'm very grateful to my collaborators and co-organizers, as well as our funders with the Catalyst Fund from the Landscape Conservation Coalition, the Northwest Boreal Partnership, and UAF, University of Alaska Fairbanks Tribal Governance Program. I also want to acknowledge I'm here in Anchorage, Alaska, on Dena'ina lands. And I'm very grateful and honored to be living here and a part of this community and to be benefiting from thousands of years of stewardship and love for the land from the peoples who've been here since time immemorial. As we transition to hearing from our speakers today, first we'll be hearing from Stanley. And then we'll transition to Eli. So I'll introduce Stan first, and then once we transition to Eli, I'll give an introduction to him as well. And then later today, we will go into our breakout group discussions to talk more about what we've heard here today. So it is my honor to introduce Stanley Majutli. He is Vuntut Gwich'in of Old Crow, which is a community in the Yukon. For us Alaskans who may or may not be familiar with Canadian geography, this is why I love these international sessions where we're making more connections across our two countries. He is a traditional father, hunter, fisherman, trapper, and dog musher, who is an active advocate for his people and their ways of life. Stan has been engaged in his First Nation government for decades since the land claims in the Yukon, and has served on multiple natural resource management and co-management committees, including the Yukon River Panel and the International Porcupine Caribou Commission. He is an elder, a traditional knowledge bearer who is often called upon for guidance. And so today we're very honored to hear his words and his wisdom, and hopefully for that to be added in to your own experience of hearing guidance from elders, which is so critical to our work and to moving forward together in a good way. And fun fact, he's also an excellent jigger. Maybe we might get a performance at some time. No, no pressure. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Stan, and thank you again for being here.
Well, with that type of introduction, I can't wait to hear myself speak. Nevertheless, I think, yeah, if I sound intense, it's just sometimes I just have that energy when I'm going to speak. So like, I got to bear with me. I think, yeah, well, I call myself an old guy. I don't call myself an elder. I call myself an old guy, senior citizen. And yeah, so nevertheless, yeah, let's get right into it. I think I got invited here by Carrie. I want to thank you very much for continuously like asking me to come and speak and that kind of stuff. Like, you know, it's hopefully it'd be helpful. Yeah, let's go to the land claims right away and get right into it. And yeah, I think we've negotiated a land claim settlement in the Yukon. So when we've done that, and it was back from the 60s, and it's a long story, so we're going to cut it short. So, and as you would know, like, you know, if you look at like the history, I know some stuff you have to work on, it takes you a long, long time. Well, you look at land claims and the amount of energy and the amount of time that people put into it in the Yukon for the First Nations. There's 11 First Nations who got their result of it, got their land claims agreement. They have self-governing powers which are equivalent to some of the provinces, jurisdictions of the provinces, and in the self-government agreement. And I didn't bring any copies. I was out setting muskrat traps and trapping out there, and then I got a call to come here, so I came here for a conference and then to do this lecture. So I'm still old-fashioned. I deal with hard copies. I like maps. I like everything. I like talking to people. And so we have a website for Old Crow, the Vuntut First Nation got our own website. They have all the information there that they're going to be speaking to. And you look at the most important documents there is the self-government agreement, the Vuntut First Nation final agreement, and the implementation agreement. And basically, the implementation for the self-government and the final agreements, plus there's an umbrella final agreement for the whole Yukon, which has 11 First Nations that have their land claims agreements also. So a result of having the land claim settlement from 1994 to date in terms of land use and land management is probably sometimes interesting and not interesting. If you look at to implement these agreements that are jurisdictional, it would take about like maybe 100,000 or 200,000 civil servants in Canada to implement all these agreements. It's got to do with different portions of the agreements. But there are some agreements that are in effect, which are the land use agreement under an umbrella under the First Nation final agreement, and also the IISAAK, the Environmental Assessment Board, which assess projects in the Yukon that affect land and water, and also the Fish and Wildlife Management Board, which make recommendations to the Yukon and federal government on fish and wildlife matters, moose, caribou, sheep, everything else in terms of like there's guiding principle within that chapter 16 of the Fish and Wildlife Management Agreement that guides the Fish and Wildlife Management Board. That would definitely look at how we manage and recommend to government on fish and wildlife, which the government definitely adhered to most of the time, and the Minister of the Fish and Wildlife and of the Natural Resources in the Yukon, which is the Minister of Environment. So, but those are the boards, and also the Yukon Salmon Committee, which is a subcommittee of the fish in the Fish and Wildlife Management Board system, which is also an agreement. And the activities in Yukon right now are placer mining. There's a Placer Mining Act that's been there since the 1900s. That hasn't changed. It's really, really outdated. And for example, you just like once you get approval for your placer mine, you can basically turn that land over and over and over again. You can dig to the gravel, you can dig to the bedrock, and you have the permit to do so. All you gotta do is set up a tailings pond. And once you have a tailings pond, then you have your settlement, all the sediments settle in there. And then you have an outlet from there with water. And then there's some mining engineer comes along and look at your whole setup. And then there's condition for affluent release into the water system. But there is no really strong law in terms of like Placer Mining Act when you talk about land uses that will have long-term devastating effects. So you can meet those requirements, have a tailings pond, but once you're done and you leave your mine, you no longer have gold there, and then you leave it, your tailing pond is settled, and then nature takes over. So it could erode that tailings pond into the river system. So there's no, once you're done, and then nature just takes over in that sense. So that really, like, there's no changes to that, you know, and there's really like that, the Placer Mining Act has a lot of like devastating effect on salmon spawning stream, and the fact that they're less regulated, which means they basically can look for gold and continue to do that. And then they can go from one end of Yukon to the other, basically, if it's possible for them to do. Except there are some lands that are protected that they cannot go on. And that's one of the most, I think, probably difficult ones to deal with. And so there's that part of the government still do the enforcement. Despite all these land claims settlements, we don't have the enforcement ability to enforce in First Nations in the Yukon off or on settlement land. So when you're talking about settlement land, let's go into that for a while. For Old Crow, we got 3,000 square miles of settlement land, and we call it Category A settlement land. The Category A settlement land, and then there's Category B. We have 2 kilometers of 4 kilometers of Category B. We have 3,000 square miles of Category A settlement land, which means we own the land from the surface to the subsurface. So, and that's basically how we own that land in Old Crow area in the Porcupine River drainage system. And the other First Nations have the other, there's 16,000 square miles of settlement land in the Yukon, and there's 10,000 square miles of Category A settlement land, which First Nations, the other 10 First Nations own separately. They have their own plots of land that they own it to the core. So so that's that type of ownership of land. So basically with commercial development and population of people in Whitehorse, where the First Nation got their settlement land there, the big question is certainty. If they want to do a commercial, if say for example, a private person in Canada wants to come to the First Nation to lease the land from the First Nation, they've worked out a certainty agreement where they can lease that land for 99 years. And then in that sense, a private person has that certainty to construct or build on that land, and to put up a building on that land, and then use it for 99 years. And after 9 years, there would be probably another agreement to be made. So that in that sense, they can borrow money from, say for example, they can get a mortgage and get stuff, they can get money from the government or other parties to put up their building. So they have assurances and they have a guarantee in that sense. So they have certainty. And that's how, like, some of the commercial land, industrial land, and residential land in downtown Whitehorse, that's how they worked it out for some of the 3 First Nations that are in that area. But at Old Crow, like, it's more isolated, and we don't have that really like demand for settlement land. But what we have done up there is in Chapter 10 of the First Nation Final Agreement. We look at protecting certain areas. It's like, while it's possible to do, like, to protect an area, let's do that. Like, you know, like, you take advantage of the political environment. So what we've done is we protected the fishing branch river. We've negotiated with the government of Yukon to protect the headwaters of the Fishing Branch River, which is a tributary into the Porcupine. We protected the whole watershed, the height of the land of that Fishing Branch River. We got that whole area protected, and then it's got another tier of protection, which is in the middle of that area, which is a refuge. So that's the spawning grounds of the chum salmon. So that has a greater protection, but for the watershed of that river from the height of the land, there's no development allowed. It's totally protected for wildlife and that type of thing. But you can still go in there and use it for recreation, for First Nations and other non-First Nation people. So the reason we protected that river is because of the salmon spawning on the Fishing Branch River itself. And that took a long, long time. Like, you know, if you want to work on a project, that just took a lot of time and a lot of energy to get that protected. And I was involved in that discussion and that negotiations with the government in terms of getting that protected. We met with the managers at the Yukon government. We met with politicians. We lobbied them. We put things forward, one principle at a time. And then eventually we got the management system in place. And on their side of the table, there were their workers were dedicated to getting this area protected. And it took about, I would say at least 6 years to get that accomplished. And in doing so, the politicians were changing hands, but there was still that continuity to get that area protected by the people that were involved and by the VGF and First Nation. So, so that area is all protected right now. And then we went and we looked at another area called the Gwich'in Nun. So that's the Whitefish Lake wetland area. So there's a lot of wildlife, moose, fish, waterfowl in that area continuously. So we got that area protected, and that's the headwaters between Bell River and the Porcupine River. So that whole area in there, we have settlement land in there, but we got that area protected. It's under the same guiding principles. And that area also has protection from industrial development. And by the way, the fishing branch is also protected from industrial development. It's written into that management plan, which it's been agreed to, and it's and our land claims agreement, those two areas are what we would call it has constitutional protection in the government of Canada by the federal law. So that was implemented into their laws in Canada. So which is similar to a federal law in the States or in United States. Yeah. So and then there's the fact that the whole Yukon River system, including Porcupine, flows from the Yukon into Alaska and right through Alaska into the Bering Sea. So in some ways we're connected, but then on the other hand, you got to wonder, well, what effects that flows into the water on the Yukon side, Canadian side, on the Yukon River that comes down the Yukon River. And I would say there's basically just the natural probably properties in the water that comes down that river right now. There's nothing out of the ordinary. And that you would say that from, let's say, for example, Fairbanks goes to a tailings pond and into the river system. So there is that, and Yukon through the settlements for tailings and whatnot. There's that. But what's really interesting is that we have a land claims agreement on water. It's called the quantity and quality flow of water. So in that agreement itself, you have a look at that agreement under the First Nation final agreement, is that the VGFN agreement is that if an upstream user is using the land for, say, for industrial development, and if you're a downstream user of that water, and if they affect your water system, and if you could prove that they are affecting your water, you could take legal action against the upstream user. So, but the fact that you have to prove it, that takes time. And that would take years of collecting a lot of data and having a lot of data loggers and studying the water and what's in the water before there was any development upstream of the downstream user. So we haven't, I don't think there's any database collected yet for that in any of the river system. Like, say, for example, I've been pushing for that for, let's just say, about 12 years with the First Nation, to ask my First Nation to be able to create research and to do some collect some scientific data on that river system. So in the sense, we can have that database, but we don't have that right now. We got some, basically the Survey of Canada have ongoing research, but just to look at what's in that water system itself, the properties that are in the water. What kind of there's natural cesium, there's natural flow of cadmium, and arsenic, which are just natural in the water, that are very, very minimal. But if you have a development, that's a whole nother matter. So the point is that you do the research to find out what's in that water prior to a development, which I think will be collective in 10 years. So what you want to do is be able to look at a court system right now. You jump right to there and say, oh, what would a judge look at to say that this data is useful to him to make a decision, or it's not useful for him to make a decision on a case of an upstream user versus a downstream user, on a water flow, and the effect of the water that has effect on a downstream user. So that in itself is still a big question out there, but the fact that there is agreement that give a direction to take that action, make that happen. So with our land claims agreement in Old Crow, we're still behind in terms of scientific research on our waterways and the actual effect of it, what would happen in terms of how it would affect the people there. So you want to research that will affect that river system directly, other than a scientist coming up doing a research on another matter that has real no effect on local people. So there's enough of that research that's collecting dust elsewhere. The international pollier came up there for 3 years. They did a lot of research that are pre-agenda, and it didn't really have anything tangible that we could look at for the land and the water system. So, and the land uses by the First Nation right now, like everyone uses the waterway. So there's navigable waterways we use for river boats. We travel in the summertime, and then we travel on over and above the land with skidoos. This winter, the caribou were 120 miles away, so we had to travel 120 miles to go hunting caribou to harvest for food. We're still an isolated community, so the practice of the culture is still there. And my nephew just went out, talking about land use, my nephew just went out on the land to north of Old Crow on our settlement land. And he had a pretty decent skidoo, but the snow is about 4.5 feet right now up there, and it's really, really heavy, and it's hard to travel in. So there's so we are practicing our culture, and now we're using our land up in our traditional territory. There's limited forests up there in terms of harvestable forests. So we always got to go find different areas to go for firewood, and we still burn firewood, and we're using fossil fuel also, diesel. And yeah, well, I'm jumping all over the place here, but I'm hoping that you can put this information together. So, okay, so when I'm saying the Porcupine River drainage system on our land claims agreement, we call what do we call a traditional territory. So we have a traditional territory for the Vuntut people to say this is our traditional territory historically. We put that into an agreement with the government of Yukon and the government of Canada. So that traditional territory is kind of like a joint administration with YG, Yukon government, and federal government. So on boards and committees, we sit on boards and committees for that traditional territory. And within that traditional territory jurisdiction is how we administer our traditional territory jointly with those two governments. And we can make recommendations on that traditional territory. In that traditional territory, there's our 3,000 square miles of land, which we as VGFN have total control over. So if there's any hydrocarbon in the no settlement land, we want to develop it, that would be definitely up to us. So far, we said no. We are still maintaining a very traditional lifestyle in the Old Crow area. We have a winter road that came into Old Crow this winter, and there was, basically a whole land application that got to be put through for that. There's the IISAAK process, the Yukon Environmental Assessment Board. Basically, have to look at that. And part of their guiding principle is the effects of the social, environmental, economic impact to the environment and to the people of that region, which is the Vuntut First Nation people. So, which in a sense, we as VGFN under that land claims agreement got to make recommendations to that board to say, here's our interests and here's what we want to protect in our traditional territory. And IISAAK, who has the board itself, have workers for them, they have assessors working for them, and they would assess the reality of our documentation or recommendation that we put forward to them in terms of the decisions they would have to make, and then in turn recommend to the Yukon government, that board, as to what their action plan should be. In a sense that, okay, we want to protect the caribou from point A to point B, the 160-mile of winter road, and basically put in there that you want limited hunters in that area, and you don't want public travel on that winter road, which is just a winter road, by the way. And then there's got to be health and safety issues considered. So those are the things for like land use plans. So you got to have all your mandatory gear if you want to travel in that area on that winter road. And then possibly if there's any like any other law, there's disruption by user of that area that cause a lot of problems. There could be fines, there could be and that type of thing. Where's generally like for pollution, whatever you cause any problems or pollution against of land, then there'd be fines, that everything for that. But which is already written into the regulations, and there'd be enforcement on that. So, and so far, it's been the compliances for the use of that road, just an example, has been pretty good. And at this point, I think the quantity and quality flow of water, I think is really something that I'd like to get a lot of research done on, in terms of like for not only for the Yukon, but the fact that we can get so much done in our traditional territory that could have a cause and effect for on Alaska side, as to how you could levy your position in terms of doing more science and research on land uses in Alaska. And because there is that continuation of the river system, so there's definitely a lot of consideration. We negotiated Porcupine Caribou Management Agreement back in 1980s. We signed it in 1985, October 26, 1985, in Old Crow. It's comprised of more than half a dozen tribes and Yukon government. And we got that legislated under the Inevaluate Final Agreement. So that board is continuous since 1985. 1987, from 1985, we negotiated another agreement with Alaska and Alaska Feds. And we negotiated the Porcupine Caribou International Agreement. It was signed July 17, 1987 in Washington, in Ottawa at the Westin Hotel. And the Secretary of Interior signed that on behalf of the US, and the Minister of Environment of Canada signed that agreement. So that international agreement is basically, it was in effect for a while, but it was complicated to get representatives on there from the American side as to how that would carry on. So if you look at that agreement to see what an international agreement, and it's really difficult to get an agreement from another country with the US. It's complicated. It's a very complicated process to do. We did it. We got one. So, and there it is, but it's not in effect right now. There's no board members on there right now. All it would take is the initiation to initiate the interest to get that board moving. But what would be the driving force behind that? And what's in that agreement that would make an interest? It'd be the only thing in there would really drive right now is the long-term interest, is the fact that they can decide on allocation. That board can make a recommendation on allocation of Porcupine Caribou, International Porcupine Caribou Agreement. And they can make, so for Alaska side, they can recommend there can be a recommendation of harvest for allocation. And on the Canadian side, they can make recommendations for the harvest on the Canadian side. That opportunity is still there within that agreement, but that board has to come into effect to make that recommendation. So I think there's, so in a sense there is, and I would say there's that international interest, and we created that interest and we got that agreement. What I'm saying here is that there's possibility for other agreements to take place between Alaska and Yukon, because that was initiated by the First Nations of Alaska and Yukon. So there could be other agreements that could be initiated there that can probably be beneficial for both countries, that are probably driven for like local uses, like I would say on this side, understanding subsistence, it could be used for subsistence uses, and also on the other side for First Nation uses and other natural uses. So to protect the river system, and I'm sure that, you know, if we work towards that, we can definitely accomplish something. I think so. The water is an important aspect of what can happen. So there's that ability to move forward on that, and so to have these agreements in principle, you needed an implementation package to implement these agreements. So we negotiated an implementation agreement with the government of Canada for the funding sources, to complement the boards and committees that need their funding sources to get their, what do we call on our side, to be board members considered a volunteer, but you still get your an honorarium per day to sit on these boards and committees. You could have a staff, you have all your functions as just maintaining your all of the recommendations and your input with the Yukon government. For example, the salmon subcommittee, we do a lot of work in that area. So the other thing is that we also have a US-Canada panel meeting, a board US-Canada panel, which definitely we talk about the salmon that comes up the Yukon River, and the management of salmon, the study of salmon, the research of salmon, and the uses of them. So they're right now, I think we're probably pretty much in a conservation zone with the salmon, the Chinook salmon that be coming up the Yukon River for the summer season. So the panel also can make recommendations to both governments on the to the four governments, I guess, 4 levels of government, 2 level on Canadian, on the US side, and 2 levels on the Canadian side. So you make recommendations, and based on recommendations from managers, based on recommendations from the Joint Technical Committee, which are the scientists and managers that sit as advising government about the science of the river system. So listening to the JTC is adhering to what they have to say in terms of like the salmon run. We discussed what that would be, and then now because of the run size, it's pretty poor. So we're looking at shutting down the Chinook, and probably chum. The fall chum would probably be the same effort. So there's that part of working together internationally on an agreement. So that's when you're looking at the land use and the use of resources and natural resources, that affects also not the land itself, but land use, the land and what the land contains. So that would be where things are at. But anyway, that's what I have for now. You got any questions? Any questions that you want to answer? Any questions at all? I'll answer, and if I can't answer it, I'll let you know I can't answer it. So go ahead. Go ahead.
Thanks, Stan. That was a lot of good information. I think I'm going to go back to the recording so I can get all the details. But I was curious. We had this day focused on the Alaskan context, and our land claims settlement looked very different than what I've seen in Canada. And I know it also in Canada, it varies across regions. The land claims look different in Northwest Territories versus with various First Nations in Yukon. And we have a structure where, the land rights have pretty much are in the hands of the federal and state government and the native corporations. And the role of tribes and tribal governments is very limited in terms of really governing the traditional lands, and also whether that's development or how we manage harvesting, things like that. So I know there's a stark contrast in terms of how it looks in Canada, and I'm just curious how what you think in terms of how the land claim settlement occurred in your region, how you feel about the sovereignty for your First Nation and other First Nations, in terms of really being able to continue stewardship of those lands, and the relationship you have with, the territorial government and the federal government, and really how that's impacted, communities today.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think I think it's always said, and I always when I do lectures, I always compliment the negotiator, our prime negotiator for a long-time settlement is Dave Joe. Dave Joe is a First Nation person, and he's a lawyer. He negotiated a long-time settlement. He was a very smart man, a very wise man, and he knew how to maneuver. And I think a result of him, we got these agreements. And the way that they happen is just basically through his being brilliant and savvy as to how we got these agreements. So on the and I know there's a difference, but okay, on Yukon land claim settlement is different than any other land claim settlement in Canada. So there was previous land claim settlement negotiated, which is the James Bay Agreement, land claims agreement. We looked at that, and then we continued. It was all strategy as to how we got the agreements. So strategically, there was always a bureaucrat sitting across from us, from the federal government. We're negotiating with them, and we couldn't. You can't negotiate with a bureaucrat. So there's always limitations. So during the election process, we lobbied the government to get an independent negotiator. And the independent negotiator was a guy by the name of Mike Whittington, who is a professor of constitutional law in Canada. Yes, he said he'll do it. So he went on the federal side to negotiate a land claims agreement with us. And then in turn, he went to each department to inform departments as to what he was negotiating with the First Nation people in the Yukon. So, and a result of that, we got a really like a pretty decent package in our land claim settlement. But the statement been made by one of our Yukon elders in the past for negotiating that this land claim settlement is not just for the First Nations. It's for non-First Nations also. It's all for all Yukoners, which today is a proven fact. We have these boards and committees which represent the environment, represent the wildlife, which is an interest of non-native and native people alike. We both have interests. Over here, on the other hand, we have our rights as First Nation people to harvest, to to a certain point. Then on the other hand, there's the non-native rights to harvest. But on the other hand, in the middle, you have these guiding principles in terms of recommendations on the harvest level, on the principle of conservation and research and wildlife on, say, for example, for moose. So there's that part of it. So there's the boards and committees are half and half basically of First Nation representatives and non-First Nation representatives. For example, the Salmon Committee for the Porcupine, for the Porcupine River, on that Salmon Committee, there's I think there's 9 seats. Anyway, I've been on there too darn long, but I can't remember seats anymore. But so 4 of them are First Nations, or 5 of them are First Nations, and then the other 5 could be anyone. So so it's for VGFN, it's written into the land claims agreement. There'd be 2 representatives of the First Nations sitting on the salmon agreement. So my idea was to put, well, let's put a non-First Nation to represent the First Nation on that seat. We need the technical and scientific expertise. So I went to my First Nation and I said, well, let's do this. And I said, yeah, we need that. So we got Al Van Finster, who was retired from Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and we got him to represent us on there, and along with myself. And that worked out really well. For the consideration of the salmon, it worked out good. So there was a lot of, on Alaska side and on Yukon side, there was a lot of uses for his knowledge and his history of work that he's done and all the hard work that he's done in terms of researching. So in that sense, that's how, and I would say that there was a combination, a collaboration of boards and committees. There's, you know, like basically representative First Nation, representative of the Yukon. So the land claim settlement in Yukon is basically for all Yukoners, and that's working out really well for Yukoners. And then there, and it's like anywhere else. If you want industrial development, that's also an interest for the companies and the corporations, and also for Yukoners. So it's, you know, like more democratic for local people. So in that sense, I think it works out really good for Yukoners, because if you're looking at like, it's not really a sovereignty question, but it leads to how you govern yourself in the Yukon. And so the I would say on like industrial development, they have all these protection boards, which are made up of First Nation, non-First Nation. So there's industrial development, and there's mine. Let's just say there's which there's happening right now. There's a lot of gold mines happening in Yukon. There's copper and there's zinc, and extracted out of a mine. And you want that development mine, but you also want safeguards for your water and for your environment. There's a bunch of boards that are in place. There's a water board. There's a IISAAK board. There's the enforcement. So if you want to mine, that doesn't mean like you have the opinion, but the fact that, well, you know, you look at yourself. You drive down the grocery store with your vehicle, which burns fossil fuel, and it takes a lot of metal to you got down there. That doesn't mean you have to like that doesn't mean we have to like basically pollute or poison our groceries on the way home. So anyways, just the view that I have for like basically like if you want to like do oil and gas development, for example, you just got to have, people want a different standard, want a good standard of life. That's what they want. So, and the good standard of life is having good environmental protection for your area, you know, for your water, for your air, for your roads, for your basically the transportation that you use, and your health and your social. So yeah, and I think that's it's when you speak out on a lot of these issues, it could get adhered to in terms of how you change regulation, how you change policy, which is continuing. So the land claims give us that ability to possibly change regulations and policies in the future, which can in turn keep up with the times. So, except for the Placer Mining Act, which we're really, really battling. You know, there's always that one thing they have a hard time with, and that's the one that we're having difficulty with. We're trying to like basically trying to get them more under control, you know, make it more reasonable. So I think in terms of the like, that's how we got to the our ownership of settlement land. And the fact that each time there's a land claim settlement happening, each First Nation that come along afterwards, the way the government works, they get less and less and less. So if there's a First Nation in Canada at the table right now, the federal government Canada negotiate their land claim settlement for what they want in terms of their land and then protecting the land and participation of themselves and non-First Nation in their area, they would not get the package that we would get today, that we've got for ourselves in Yukon. They would get probably less than that in terms of jurisdiction, in terms of power and legislation, because they're negotiating with government of Canada. So as time goes on, but there is no like real sovereignty written into our agreements. You know, the sovereignty issue is still probably like in agreements, or probably like in the treaties, which are with Canada and the British Crown at this point. There's the proclamation of 1763. There's the 1870 Order of Rupert's Land, which had an effect on Canada. And there's the the British North America Act, the PNA Act, which had a real effect on Canada in terms of how it got established. But in 1982, we went to, the government of Canada went to the Crown and got, they got proclaimed as probably their own country to get their own constitution. Therefore, we got our own constitution in 1982 and started establishing what the real jurisdiction is in Canada for Canada itself to run its own country. So I think in a sense it's young and it's old at the same time. So the Yukon government is not it's not territory at this point, and it's not a province at this point. It doesn't have that jurisdiction. That's the government. But there's a devolution. It's in a devolution process. So there's jurisdictional powers going from the federal government to the Yukon continuously. So they're devolving their authority and their responsibilities to the Yukon government. So along with responsibility and the privilege, there comes a lot of obligations too. So so that's where the Yukon is at, but at the same time, we got our claim settlement, which in a sense, it doesn't really have no negative effect, but it has more possibly like positive effect in how you're going to work together. So, and then there's that part of it, but education is always continuous. That's always continuous for the people. And sometimes the federal government forget that we've got a land claim settlement in Yukon, you know. So we've got to continuously remind them, go back to Ottawa and remind them that we do have a land claim settlement, there's jurisdiction, there's things that got to be implemented and that type of thing. So at some point in time, say for example, you got a big question, what do we want to do in North? Do we have our own autonomy? That's still another thing that I've been preaching about for to my leadership, just as an individual member and doing my civic duty to say, well, hey, you need to do something about your own autonomy here. We do have that ability to do it. Let's look at what we want to create our own funding, our own like resources, other than the fact we're getting limited funding as a fiscal transfer from the government of Canada, which comes to the First Nation, rather than it going from federal government to Yukon government, that fiscal transfer. So in a sense, we can manage our community as Whitehorse can manage its own community getting its fiscal transfer. So, and we're doing that in our community. So if you come to Old Crow, if you look at Old Crow, you would say, you would look at it to say, how did you get where you're getting to? How did you get where you got to? Because like, for example, we took advantage of the political environment of the Yukon. We have $11 million solar system right now for our energy source. So in the summer, the generators turned off. You don't hear any noise in the community in the summertime, but we still have a dust problem. We didn't solve that problem. You know, there are vehicles and that kind of stuff, and 4-wheelers, quads driving all over the place. So we need to resolve that issue. But on the other hand, we have solar panel on a lot of buildings. We work out the payments with the electrical company to work out how we gain revenue from putting electricity back into the grid system. So we're looking at that part of it, and we have one of the biggest modern day battery in Old Crow that from generating electricity and that kind of stuff from the solar system. So we're looking at our advancement as to how we use less fossil fuel and more energies, different source of energy for the community, and that's going to be continuous, you know. And I think the lifestyle is changing, so there's hardly anyone out trapping anymore because there's no economy there. You have a few trappers that are out there trapping to make their own traditional clothing for their kids and for themselves, you know. And right now I got a fur hat. My daughter made that for me. I trapped that muskrat and she tanned the hide, and her and my son to tan the hide, and then they turned and made a muskrat hat for me. So in a sense, there's like the little economy of the fur there. Yeah. So yeah, that's the yeah. Okay, go ahead.
We're loving this. I've got Eli here waiting, and I want to make sure that we can move over to him. Did you have any final thoughts you wanted to share in the next minute or so before we shift over to Eli?
Yeah, I'm driving from Fairbanks. I'm driving back to Whitehorse. And that's 10.5 hour drive. And then I fly back to my community, which is it's a 4-hour flight. So I came here basically to be able to talk about the salmon in terms of research and science. And that's what I did. I'm not bragging, I'm just saying that that's what it took. Not martyring myself, but to do my civic duty to represent a resource. That's what it takes. And that's how basically we got our land claim settlement. It's just a discipline to get it, you know. So it's a lot of work, and we have it, but it's not over. It's just the beginning of the beginning. So I just want to say that there's that continuous energy. So next December, I'm going to be driving from Whitehorse to Anchorage to talk about salmon and represent my interest for the salmon on the Porcupine River. And right now that stocks has been decimated, the chum stocks. So I want to say to you guys is that it doesn't matter what age you are, and you know, the fact that if you have a career, you have commitment to do it, and then if you look back on your life to say, well, hey, I made a difference, then your career and your life has meant something.
Well, thank you. Thank you so very much for being here and for all the years of dedication, and also for working across the border. And that's a big reason why we put together this course with the intention of it including both Alaska and Western Canada, because we are connected. And it's important to remember that. Sometimes we forget with all the jurisdictions divided up, but it's really important that we work together across the border. So we appreciate you being here and sharing your knowledge. And be safe on the road, please. I've done that trip myself over to Whitehorse. It's a beautiful drive. And thank you again so much for being here today. And I think we just wanted, before we get started with Eli, were we, to my co-organizers, wanting to do a quick kind of just show of hands of who's from Alaska versus who's from Canada? We're doing that right now. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Let's do a raise of hands of who is on listening from Canada.
And you can do the raise hand function under reactions if you are here from Canada. And if you want to see folks, go to your participants list. Looks like we mostly have Alaskans here. I'm seeing a handful of Canadians.
See 12. Yeah, 12 hands up for Canadians.
Out of about 70 folks, which is interesting because I'm really glad to see that there are a lot of Alaskans here who are interested in learning about Canada. And for the Alaskans, you can unraise your hands, our Canadian friends. Is this your first time really hearing about how things work in Canada in terms of land claims, land planning, you know, land stewardship? And if this is your first introduction, you can raise your hand with the raise hand function under reactions. Yeah, we're seeing a few dozen folks. Awesome.
Looks like 20. That's great.
Yeah. Cool. And hopefully for those who are somewhat familiar, that you're going to be gaining some new knowledge and insights today. So I'm going to shift gears to introduce our next speaker. Eli Enns is the great grandson of Nawasam. Am I saying your grandfather's name correctly, Eli?
Yeah, that's pretty good. Thank you.
And he's from it's Clayoquot. Is that also his first
Yeah.
name?
Cloquet, yeah.
Clayoquot. Awesome. Thank you for your help with that. And on Eli's mother's side, he's a second generation immigrant from the Netherlands, grandson of Peter Enns. And he is a happy father. And I didn't know this, a grandfather. How awesome.
Yeah, I have 2 grandchildren.
Wow. You
Yeah.
definitely do not look like a grandfather. And so Eli, he's an internationally recognized expert in biocultural heritage conservation and Indigenous economic development. He's a nation builder and Canadian political scientist focused on constitutional law, geopolitics, and ecological governance. Eli is also on the board of directors for the Canadian Committee for IUCN. And very cool, Eli is the co-founder of the, and you don't have to help me with pronunciation, Haukman, did I say that one correctly? Tribal Park in the Cloquet Sound UNESCO Biosphere Reserve on Vancouver Island. Eli was also the co-chair for the Indigenous Circle of Experts for the Pathway to Canada Target 1. And I'll just point out to Lauren's question, there's some connection there to the Truth and Reconciliation process that you'd asked about in the chat. And he's the CEO and president of IISAAK OLAM Foundation. And Eli co-founded and provides strategic guidance for the, and you'll hear this, IPCA. You'll hear that acronym a lot for Alaskans. That's Indigenous, Protected, and Conserved Areas. So the IPCA Development Fund and IPCA Innovation Program at Make Way, Canada. So I've had the pleasure of collaborating with Eli over the last year on the transboundary dialogues to talk about transboundary conservation between Alaska and the US, or sorry, the US and Canada. And I'm very grateful to have him here today to share with you all. Thank you so much, Eli, for being here. And do you have slides to share? Do you need me to make you a co-host in case you need
No slides.
Okay. All right, great. Well, please take it away. And thank you, Eli.
Thank you so much, Liana, and thank you to the elder. And he said at the beginning, he said, "I'm not an elder, I'm an old fella." So thank you to the old fella for all the wisdom and knowledge that you shared and the experience. And I also want to acknowledge, that we have one of our team members today on the call as well, who will be able to help drop drop links and such as I go here. So yeah, thank you again, Liana. And I have all the time in the world for students, because there's this kind of momentum that's happening right now, and how there's a shift that's happening. And this was something that was predicted by many of the elders. And I heard a story from the Yukon, actually, where the old fellow there was talking from about the predictions that were made during early contact with newcomers. And it was kind of, I don't know, like I got goosebumps, because on the far east coast in Mi'kma'ki, Unama'ki, like Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, whatnot, similar stories, similar predictions. And of course, where I'm from on the west coast of Vancouver Island, our elders also made similar observations during the times of early contact. And I'm talking about, the early days and weeks and months of early contact with newcomers. And essentially what that was is that there was a prediction that, based on the culture and level of sophistication of technology and such, with the of the newcomers that there would be hard times ahead. And for example, one of our elders spoke about a dream that they had, that the newcomers would eat everything, that they would eat the forests, they would eat the ocean, they would eat the mountains, and they would even eat the sky. And you know, now we see with the sophistication of science, and this is another irony of the whole situation, is that there's a lot of people out there who think that science is going to address the problem that science created, by the way. You know, it just allows for very efficient destruction and consumption of nature. And anyways, so with the industrial science that is now unleashed upon our landscapes, the dream of that elder has come true, talking about how the newcomers would eat everything, even eat the sky, eat the mountains, eat all the forests, and eat the oceans. You know, how horrible is that idea? And so, but the prediction is that when this happened, when all that destruction was happening, the great grandchildren of the newcomers, they would come to our great grandchildren and they would ask for help and guidance. And so the message through the generations was that despite how bad it might get, you have to hold on to your teachings about how to live in the world in a good way, with nature and with one another. And not only that, but you have to hold on to the most sacred teachings about love and forgiveness and humanity, so that you don't have a bad heart when the great grandchildren of the newcomers come to our great grandchildren and ask for help and guidance after the destruction. Now, to put that into context a little bit, there was a big floods in British Columbia last year, and everyone was blaming climate change. And they said, we need to turn to the scientists to help us get out of this hard place we're in. I tell you, I was ill from the irony of that, for weeks and weeks, listening to these news broadcasters talk about how science can solve the problems of climate change. Science created the problems. There's like very clearly, when the newcomers came to British Columbia, they had the audacity to think that they could drain a whole lake, damming rivers and draining lakes, using dikes to get access to the fertile lake beds of the Sumas Nation. Chief Silver told me, first time I ever met him, he talked about how 100 years ago, the newcomers, they drained that lake, and the elders forewarned them what would happen, but they still went ahead and did it. And you know what? All of those people in Abbotsford that got all the livestock that died horribly, and all of the pollution from their fuel reserves and all the fertilizer, reserves and everything, all the stuff they use, that all got washed into the nature, by the way. Now, all of those people who made those decisions, they are dead and gone a long time ago. The ones who decided to drain that lake, but their children and their grandchildren are suffering the consequences of their misguided, it's to think that you can just conquer nature with science is really, misguided. There's a word that I'm missing right now to describe that. But anyways, it'll come to me. And now their grandchildren are suffering. And unfortunately, the dominant narrative is to say that, climate change is to blame because the storms are getting worse. But the reality is that was a lake. And the newcomers drained that lake and thought that they could outthink Mother Nature, out-engineer Mother Nature. Land use planning. My niece, she heard that word land use planning and she got upset. And she stood up and she had to speak at this gathering in Ottawa. She said, why are we talking about land use planning? We should be talking about land relationship planning. How do we have a better relationship? And ironically, this goes to the very word economy itself. By a show of hands, is there anyone on this call who knows what the word economy means? Uh-oh, Liana. What's the word economy mean?
How you take care of your home.
Ah, very close, yes. Economy, right, is related to the word ecology and ecosystem. How strange that might feel, but the word economy means the wise and prudent management of the home. So yeah, Liana is pretty bang on there. Ecology is the study of the house. And of course, the Greeks understood, like many, it's not just indigenous peoples, by the way, it's traditional societies all around the world who understood this more profound relationship with the earth. But whenever you go somewhere else and try to take other people's stuff, this is colonization, then you kind of let go of those values and those teachings, and it's all about efficiency. Christy Clark, the former premier of British Columbia, she talked about seizing British Columbia's LNG opportunity, liquid natural gas. And I thought, what an interesting choice of words, because when you seize something, imagine I'm going to come in and seize your belongings. I'm going to seize this opportunity. And she was actually speaking truth, because that's exactly what the provincial government of British Columbia has been doing, is they've been seizing assets, seizing natural resources from somebody else. Whenever you meet somebody who names a place based on numbers, you know that they don't belong. Tree farm license 47, tree farm license 56, highway 102, you know, our people have actual names for our places that go back thousands of years into the relationships to those places. And the IISAAK, like what's happening on those lands, those waters. So yeah, they've been seizing opportunities for a long time, and that's where land use planning comes in. The other problem with land use planning, and I'm not trying to be a wet blanket here, I'm just kind of trying to share some truth, is that oftentimes the dominant actor in the relationship will come in and they're saying, okay, look, I need to get your consent. I'm going to try and figure out how to get it. All right, so what part of your lands are you willing to sacrifice to my industrial greed? Insatiable, by the way, it's insatiable. And what part of your land is sacred to you and you want to keep nice and pretty? This is the whole debauchery of, by the way, I don't want to speak over my time limit. How long do you want me to speak to here, Liana?
I would say let's keep going for another 20 minutes or so.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, so like land use planning is like the dominant state actor, and what's his name? Premier Ford, Doug Ford. He kind of did a funny favor to the nations in the north there. They were legislating required land use planning in Northern Ontario. And what Doug Ford didn't realize is that this was part of a strategy to get access to the Ring of Fire, which is one of the largest mineral deposits in North America. It's huge, and there's chromite and there's all kinds of required metals for variety of different technologies. But it happens to also coexist, and this is not uncommon, by the way. A lot of sacred natural sites for Indigenous peoples correspond with dense mineral deposits of precious metals. And you know why that might be? Is because the earth is an energetic thing. It's an energetic phenomenon. Deep inside the earth is what you call the electromagnetic, the very dense iron core that's spinning rapidly and creating electrical energy that goes out through the structures of the earth, and it beams out to our near atmosphere and creates something called an electromagnetosphere. And that electromagnetosphere is the second line of defense from interstellar debris, which would wreak havoc on our planet if we did not have that energetic force field. The first line of defense is the heliosphere, which is the energetic cloak of our sun. And that intercepts a lot of interstellar debris, and the stuff that gets through gets caught up in the electromagnetosphere. And then it also then lands, some gets through to that, and like comets and such. But anyways, the Indigenous peoples understood that, the Indigenous peoples, the sacred natural sites are also interconnected with mineral deposits. It's happened in Australia. It was happening in the north. And so anyways, the previous provincial government of Ontario had legislated a land use planning exercise with the Indigenous peoples of Treaty 9 territory in Northern Ontario. And this was exactly that. They were saying, okay, give and take here. It's a horse trade. What do you want to keep? And what are you willing to sacrifice? They literally call it a sacrifice zone when you go into industrial scale development. Thousands of years to heal that land. And then, of course, you've got the divided thought process of the parks and protected areas. Conventional parks and protected areas is sort of basically like, okay, what are you willing to sacrifice? What do you want to protect? So for a lot of people, Indigenous protected and conserved areas, IPCAs, is just another form of that same land use planning. But I suggest to you that this is not a good way for us to go. We need to be more holistic in our thinking and the types of solutions that we bring to bear. And before you can get sound solutions, of course, you need to understand the problem. And as far as I could follow it in my short years of this, and speaking to people who were much more wiser and experienced than I am, is that we root it all back to paradigm. How do you see the world? Through what cultural lens, through what cultural lens do we see the world? And I had the odd honor of co-presenting at a conference in Northeast India in 2015 with Prince Charles of the royal family. And it was Indigenous Terra Madre. It was a big a big party in Northeast India. And Prince Charles was making the keynote address, and he spoke about how war and overpopulation and capitalism and greed and all of these problems that we identify are actually not the problem. They're actually just symptoms of an underlying common root problem. And Prince Charles argued quite convincingly that the root problem that gives rise to all of these symptoms, including overpopulation, by the way, is not the actual problem. He argued that it's a worldview of disconnectedness, a cultural paradigm that wants to see everything in pieces, disconnected from each other, to neurotically study under a microscope the disconnectedness. And this is where the irony of physics goes, and I really feel like a grumpy old man at times here, but you know, once science progressed to a certain point, they got into something called physics and quantum physics, and they realized the farther they look, the more strange reality becomes. It used to be that we have liquids, solids, and gases, and that's just the way it was. Some things change states, whatever. But when you get right down to it at the atomic level, observing the smallest things in creation, what they realized is that they couldn't fully take stock of all of the characteristics of anything because it was in a constant state of transformation and flux. This was led to, I believe it was Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty, that whenever you think that you've fully taken stock of the characteristics of something, it's changed. And in our language, in Njootli, we call that koi kwiksup. Our ancestors knew that. Our ancestors understood that. What Charles was saying was that their worldview of disconnectedness, and this is what science is fundamentally based upon, is studying things in pieces. Objective. How do you be objective studying something without influencing it? It's goofy, really. It's absolutely insanity to think that that can ever really happen. We're a connected part of the universe, my friend. However objective you try to be, you know, he shook IISAAK in our language. Everything is one and everything is interconnected. And so it's like the example that I use is taking a frog and cutting it up into little pieces and dissecting it versus sitting back and watching that frog and observing how it interacts with nature, how it interacts in the world. Then you can learn about the world through the frog. You know, that's millions of times more beneficial to you than to cut that thing into little pieces and figure out all the valves and little things. And so inhumane the way, you know, the way science just treats nature is it's like, you know, study palette of whatever. But not only is it tragic and inhumane, it's actually kind of self-destructive. So you're actually not doing yourself any favor by pursuing that disconnected worldview. You're actually just creating more problems for yourself, unfortunately. And so that's what I want to say about land use planning. IPCAs is a holistic model of understanding that humanity is a part of environment. The Greeks understood it, you know, the word economy itself is the wise and prudent management of the home. And the home isn't the physical dwelling in which only human beings dwell. The home is an all-encompassing understanding of an interconnected ecosystem, which is why ecology, economy, and ecosystem share that same root in the Greek language. We've lost track of some really simple but powerful teachings. So it's not going to be some new nuclear fission or scientific exploration, or science is not going to solve climate change, by the way. I'll just tell you that right now. Spoiler alert. It's going to be a new paradigm. You know, and I apologize if I've offended any scientists in the room, but I think that, you know, I could get hit by a bus tomorrow, and so I could maybe I should speak my truth today. Another one is the dirty 30s and the Great Dust Bowl in the Central Plains of North America. I saw a recent news article that cited climate change as the cause of that, but the reality is it was genocide. Genocide of the United States of America against the Dakota people. They tried to wipe out the Dakotas, but they couldn't do it because the Dakota people were too resilient. So what did they do? They went after their food source. They went after the bison and the indigenous grass species. The indigenous grass species in the Great Central Plains of North America had evolved over thousands of years with the bison and the Dakota people themselves. And it allowed them to hold water in the root system 3 meters deep into the earth, hold that water during droughts. And so when the United States pioneer frontiersmen or whatever, when they plowed up all those indigenous grass species to plant wheat, one of the most least resilient species you could possibly plant in there. It has such a shallow root system. And so you get a drought, you're ending up with a desert now. And then because of their stubbornness, here's the other irony of it, is that they turn to science. How can we make this desert fertile once again, like the Dakotas had? Well, let's use toxic chemical fertilizers and toxic chemical herbicides and pesticides so that we could go on with our insane agricultural enterprise. The cows didn't last one winter. The bison had this thick coat, thick skin, and they knew how to survive in the cold winters of the Central Plains of North America. The cows were literally left to freeze, so they had to make houses for them and heat them in the wintertime. And they called that the, what was it? It was like it was the American spirit overcoming adversity, that they used all this crazy scientific debauchery to grow wheat and keep those cows alive in those factory farms with pigs and the inhumane treatment there. Anyways, I'm definitely not a grumpy old man. But I'll say this to end, is that this year, 2022, is the 210th year anniversary of the War of 1812. And as you may know, this was the sort of culminating geopolitical event which formalized borders between primarily the 49th parallel. It didn't coagulate right away. It took a little while, but it created that geopolitical boundary between Canada and the United States. But of course, who was in Alaska at that time was the Russians. The Russians were coming. And so I think it's very interesting that what's happening geopolitically in the world today, because of course the United States bought Alaska from the Russians. It was Russian North America until the 1860s or so. So my point of ending on this note is that history is ever upon us, and the decisions we make today are going to create the reality of our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren to come. And so I thank you for tolerating my frustrated intervention here. And I want to, I want to share it with all of your students that I care about you and your future and your education. And I want you to have a good life and to have a safe environment for your children and your grandchildren. And so kleko, kleko, chew.
Thank you, Eli. You made me chuckle when you made a joke about grumpy old man. But I also got goosebumps when you were talking about the visions and dreams from the elders, and particularly the part about the children and grandchildren of those people coming back and asking for help. And I think that's, coming back to that place of why we're here, literally on this Zoom call, in our in the work that we do. It's more than just work. It's more than our jobs or whatever our job title is. We're here taking care of our home and one another. And given that we have a lot of Alaskans here on this call, with the work that you have been doing specifically with IPCAs, the Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, I wanted to flag that we'd had a question about, the impacts of the Truth and Reconciliation process. And I know that over time, that process in which the Canadian government was going through this with Indigenous peoples of Canada, through the, the pathway to Target 1, which for those who want to know what that is, that's part of the 30 by 30 initiative globally to protect 30% of the world's, lands by 2030. That IPCAs came about, and I just was wondering if, we went from really powerful words, if you really create in the major context of why we're here and why things are happening the way they are today. These models, people are asking for what are models that we can look to for how we do this work together and do it in a good way. And that's why I love hearing about IPCAs as an Alaskan, because I look to that model as here's a way to do that work in a good way. And I was wondering if you would be able to speak to what that actually looks like, what you think we in Alaska can learn from that, and how we can work together to empower that level of collaboration and supporting Indigenous leadership.
Yeah, so the IPCA model is something that could be available. There's also the ICCA consortium, which is kind of similar to, like, IPCA is just a Canadian version of that. And we're also looking at transboundary IPCAs. So I think that that is something that is available, and I think Sude has been dropping some links into the chat about IPCAs, and yeah, and so this is something that we should pursue in coordination across geopolitical boundaries, because those are very artificial, of course. And yeah, so thanks for the question.
Are there questions for Eli in the audience? I'm looking in the chat as well.
Yeah, I think I upset someone about my comment about purchasing the United States. This was just the history that the Russians were there in Sitka, but I'm open to being enlightened. The United States did not purchase.
Yeah, honestly, I'm still learning about that history. It is a very controversial thing.
Yeah, they say, yeah, they're on March 30th, 1867, the United States reached an agreement to purchase Alaska from Russia for a price of $7.2 million. The treaty with Russia was negotiated and signed by Secretary of State William Seward and Russian minister to the United States. So maybe, like, the Russians knew that they couldn't actually get full, footing there, and they were willing to strike a deal to let go of their aspirations, maybe might be a better term, because there was a whole bunch of other international geopolitics happening in the aftermath of the fur trade. There was, like, the Nootka Treaty, but yeah, it's such an on-point conversation right now, because there's Russian military buildup in the north right now. So anyways, I'm not trying to drag the conversation to that, but you know, like land use planning, you can have the best land use plans you want, but how do we, you know, how do we mention, this is the beauty of the IPCA model, and what our ancestors had figured out is that it's easier sometimes to ceremoniously give away your surplus goods rather than to make war or to engage in conflict with your neighbors over scarce resources. And so I think what the world needs now is that kind of wisdom about peace building, finding innovative ways to build a peaceful economy. There's speculation right now that the so-called global economy has come to an end, you know, and of course that's what the Cold War was all about. There was this vying of control for economic control of the planet between the former Soviet Union and the United States of America, apparently, with all the proxy wars along the way. But for a few decades, it seemed that capitalism had prevailed and to create the neo-liberal global economic system. But now there's many who are saying that that's come to an end now. So what are some other intelligent and healthy economic paradigms that we can point to look at reinvigorating and bringing about a renaissance of peace and friendship, which are quite intelligent international social innovations that are based on observations of natural law and how nature comes to balance within itself. And that's the, you know, traditional ecological knowledge of Indigenous peoples, like in land use planning. That's one of the things that oftentimes people point to is traditional ecological knowledge about plants and animals, which is also important. But traditional ecological knowledge and Indigenous knowledge systems also has a lot to offer with regards to social innovation and how do we behave better with each other. So thank you again for your time and for the question, and for, sorry if I upset anyone about that purchase thing, but there was a transaction that happened. But of course, there may be some more enlightenment that I would be happy to receive.
Yeah, that's a whole other conversation for another day, and it is very complicated, and it's just one version of the history. I wasn't sure, Chiscook, I saw you off mute, if you were wanting to make a comment or question.
Oh, I don't want to go on a rabbit trail too much, but I was just gonna say that, yeah, Russia was really relegated to tiny little places on the beach. So they did not own Alaska and did not have the right to sell it to the United States. That's why that comment was in there. But I think you picked that up, Eli. Good job.
Thank you, Chiscook, for that. I still am what I consider a new Alaskan. I've been here for 5 years, and I'm always learning from everyone. And that, yes, that aligns very much with what I've heard as well. Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Eli, for being here, and you always share very powerful words. And, you know, if any of those words felt uncomfortable, you know, I really invite and welcome when we sit in these uncomfortable spaces, because it means we're being challenged. And that's really how we grow and move forward. And we may have different, you know, ideas and opinions on these things, but it's so important to have these spaces to listen to one another. And I appreciate, Eli, that you're also putting that care out there, that, you know, these are words of peace and friendship and
grumpy old men.
And and speaking your truth. And that's why we create these forums, because, you know, dialogue is how we are going to move forward in a good way, respectful dialogue and hearing from one another. And that I'm going to make this segue into, for the breakout groups, you know, we've mentioned this in our last session by Eli. You know, oftentimes in these settings, we think, okay, I've heard from our esteemed speakers. I'm going to sign off and get back to my other priorities instead of participating in breakout discussions, or this feels a little nerve-wracking to get together with a bunch of strangers and talk about this. But this is part of the work. If we want to evolve our understanding, we need to talk to one another. So one aspect is sitting and listening, taking that in, integrating, and then to engage in dialogue. So if you can, please stay for the breakout group discussions. They are important. We really very much appreciate you being here and participating in that part of the class and that part of our learning and growing. We're going to move into our breakout discussions and have about half an hour to chat together, and then we'll come back together about quarter of, and we'll provide an opportunity for folks to volunteer to share out some of the things that they discussed in their groups. So our team has been creating breakout discussion prompts based on what we're hearing from our speakers. And so behind the scenes, there's like some, back and forth as we are thinking about what prompts to bring forward to the group. And so if you look in the chat, for those who appreciate reading prompts like I do, Carrie Stevens just posted our discussion prompt, and I'll read it out loud for those on the phone. How do we move forward reconciliation and healing in the work of land, you could say land use planning, land relationship planning, land planning? And how do we find common ground and equity in the engagement of both Western science and Indigenous knowledge? What are some of the basic on the ground steps that we can take to get to this place? So again, how do we move forward reconciliation and healing in the work of land planning? How do we find common ground and equity in the engagement of Western science and Indigenous knowledge? And what are some basic on the ground steps that we can take? So let's focus on, rather than barriers and challenges, what are ways that we can move forward? How can we remove some of those barriers and challenges and create new opportunities? I'm going to let my colleagues send us out into our breakout groups, and we'll be here in the main room to help troubleshoot for those who don't receive their invitations. And we'll see you in 30 minutes. So hopefully you should be seeing invitations to join your breakout room. And just a reminder, if you guys want to go on mute while people are coming back in, so we can reduce any background noises. I think everyone is back here that was in the breakout groups. So hopefully you got with the 2-minute warning, you got enough time to wrap up your thoughts, and that hopefully having 30 minutes felt like at least some time to get into the meat of this. But really, I mean, we need like days and weeks to have this conversation. Is there anyone who is interested in sharing out from some of the highlights of what you talked about?
I wanted to check in and see if folks understand what truth, reconciliation, and healing is, because we had a few people who just needed the brief intro. So I'm wondering.
Do you want to just summarize that, Crystal, right now while you're here?
Sure. I'll do my best. So truth, there's the truth piece, which if you're like me and you went K through university without learning anything about the Indigenous people of the place you live or the place you're going to university at, then you didn't learn the full truth of Indigenous history or Indigenous peoples. So the truth piece is really about uncovering the full truth of who the people are, how long they've been here, time immemorial, and the impacts that governments, churches, educational systems, etc., had on Indigenous people and continue to have. That's the truth piece. Reconciliation, then, it would be the recognition and acknowledgement by those institutions of the impact they had and have on Indigenous people. And then the reconciliation piece, the healing piece is often involves apologies and forgiveness, and that's the healing piece. And it really has been underway in Canada, and we're starting to barely scratch the surface here in Alaska. So that's a little intro. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Crystal, for that. That's really important. I'm glad you provided that context.
Can I just add one thing that people tend to forget? Some of the colonization happened earlier and some of it happened later. I've worked with elders here in Kenai who had their lands where they were living taken right out from under them and given to homesteaders. And the Native people didn't qualify to even get their own home. And then like Jim Pete, who helped do a lot of place names in about the Anchorage area, he got kicked out of his home twice and pretty much ended up homeless. About the time I think that book was probably published because of Wasilla wanted his property. So there's still people alive today that it's not like.
Sorry, Tia, you got muted somehow. We missed the last part there.
So it's still, it's not history, it's the present that we're still dealing with some of the colonization. You know, when you have people alive that got moved off their own homelands and told that they didn't qualify to get in.
Right, and that the traumas that occurred continue to live in my generation and my kids' generation because the traumas get passed down to the next generation. So the healing piece is really important because it is ongoing. So thank you, Tia.
Thank you, Tia, and thank you, Cheese Cook. It's really important that we keep talking about this and coming to a common understanding of what's really necessary and needed for us to move forward in a good way. Are there others who want to share some of the highlights of what you spoke about in your breakout groups? Randy?
I was volunteered as my group, so I will do a little bit. And what I did share, and I want to share it with everybody that can, is certainly this document here. And if you go to Council of Yukon First Nations, you can get this book online. This is the document that the Yukon chiefs took to Pierre Trudeau in January of '73. So the start of the conversation for land claims. Now, Stanley Majutli is a signatory to this, and so, you know, kind of that's the history. But this this is the conversation that I was introduced to when I came here. Well, Randy, this is the start of the conversation, right? And I shared with my group just a couple of things that are in here, and we still use this today as a learning piece. So here, this one is comments on communications, okay? Which we're talking about right now. As we said in chapter 3, there's an immediate need to change the present communication system, 1973. Now the whites do all the talking and the Indians have to listen. Oh. We do not expect the white people to understand and respect us unless we have an opportunity to talk and they are willing to listen. So where our conversation went was, that's good, but fundamentally within culture, within thinking, an Indigenous way doesn't have judgment in it. A Western academic way is judge. Data, result, do. Data, result, do. It's all based on a judgment decision basis, right? So that's the first thing we have to get to. And that's the first thing I was taught. Randy, you cannot come here and judge. You come here to help. We all help. We all help each other, right? If you have some angry issues about this, talking about land being taken, good. Let's talk about that. And it's most interesting, I think, the comments coming out of the Métis from Manitoba meeting with the Pope. Today, we cannot change the past, but we can use the past to learn, understand, and go forward with no judgment. Guys, team, does that cover what we kind of talked about?
Thanks, Randy.
You're welcome. Thanks for doing this.
I really appreciate that. And if anyone wants to put in the chat box any things that you shared or you want to react to what you're hearing, please feel free. Are there others who'd like to share in our last few remaining minutes together?
I'm happy to share with our group.
Great.
We spoke a lot about equity in our group, and we talked about it in a few different ways. And one thing that we discussed was when we're talking about equity, because it's been such a hot topic in the last 2 years specifically, we had a little discussion around how equity is focused around human beings. And we're not really thinking about equity among all living things when we're talking about equity. So how do we make sure to keep that in mind when we're having these conversations and not just make it equitable for, Indigenous people and people of color when we're doing land use planning, but also make sure that we're keeping in mind that the trees and the birds and the fish and all living beings are all on the same level, and there's nothing that's better than the other. And another thing we discussed around equity was oftentimes when we're talking about equity, we're talking about making sure that we're making it equitable for, again, like Indigenous people or people of color. But I think, strongly that when we're having these conversations, oftentimes Indigenous people are the ones that are coming to the table with most of the knowledge. We have to learn all of the Western science, the Western history, the Western politics, Western social structure. And then we have our traditional knowledge and our tradition, which is our traditional science, our traditional social structures. And so we have this entirety that we bring to the table, but Western people that come to the table are usually only versed in Western science and knowledge. And so how do we open this door up so that traditional intellect is not extracted from, but understood on a broader level, so that everybody who comes to the table has that same type of investment and has that same, that similar knowledge and background, so that we can make decisions together and not be having to spend 95% of the time explaining traditional ecological knowledge and why it's important and how it's interconnected with social structure and how important it is for that kid to bring herring eggs to the elder down the street, because in turn they're going to learn about you know, the seaweed coming up and different pieces of science. So equity is something that we discussed in kind of a different form.
Wow, thanks for sharing that, Marina. And when you mentioned the first piece too about equity and, you know, moving beyond the idea that we're only considering human beings and equity, but, you know, other beings as well. I'm hoping that we'll be able to bring in an elder from the Yukon to talk about a model that he developed for land relationship planning that is based in that idea of equity and representing other beings, not just peoples. So fingers crossed on that one. And I also, you know, in our remaining minute, I wanted to, then that can segue us into just like the sneak peek for when we do meet in 2 weeks. We are going to be diving into some of these models and what they look like for what Indigenous land planning and engaging in this collaboratively looks like. So we do have confirmed the folks with the Tyonek Tribal Conservation District that are based in Alaska that will be sharing the model for how they've been doing this work with their communities, their tribal government, corporations, the state and federal governments, nonprofits, truly in that collaborative way of how we work together in a good way for our lands and our peoples. And that'll be on Tuesday, 2 weeks, a little less than 2 weeks from now. And then our last class, we're going to have Carolina Behe from Inuit Circumpolar Council to talk about, you know, ethical and equitable ways of working together. And we'll also have folks from the Sustainable Southeast Partnership to talk about, again, that same model for how you work together across all these different entities in Southeast Alaska. And, you know, this is our time to be inspired, because we often hear from people, this feels so overwhelming. There's so many barriers. There's so many things we've inherited from, you know, all these practices and policies and bureaucracies and all kinds of stuff. Like, how do we really break out of this? And it's going to be piece by piece. And it's great to hear from those, you know, those who are really moving this work forward and pushing us forward. So I'm very excited for us to gather again in 2 weeks. And I'm just grateful for you all being here. And for those of you who stuck it out for the breakout group discussions, good job. Gold stars for you. And thanks for all the great discussion in the chat as well. And we will see you in a little less than 2 weeks on Tuesday, same time, same place. And yeah, Don, I see you have a question, and I'll let others sign off if they need to go.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you know, this was a great session, and in our group, I'm not the spokesperson of our group until you summarize kind of things in the chat. But the important things in my experience is when you want integration, you have to integrate. And you have to set up the process for success, and so that you do have an integrated system. And I was involved I was a director of Fish and Wildlife in 1991, 2 years prior to land claims being ratified. And we sat down and said, we can't have a Whitehorse-based Fish and Wildlife branch running fish and wildlife and managing lands. We need people in the communities. Our staff has to go live in the communities. So we established 5 regional bio positions in 5 communities where they worked on a day-to-day basis with First Nations. And that was the best thing we ever did. Those, they listened to the elders and to the First Nations. They brought that information back, to the branch. And I just want to use that as an example. You can't have a branch in Whitehorse running, managing fish and wildlife all over the territory. You have to put people into the communities And also the resource councils and the boards were set up with, you have to have equal participation. You can't just have symbolic representation. You have, the Land Clearance Agreement said there has to be equal participation of First Nation knowledge and interest and government representatives with the scientific and technical component of the boards and councils. And that was one of the best things they ever did in negotiating the agreements. So you have to set the system up for success. That's the point I'm trying to make. And then you've got to monitor and learn what things aren't working the way they should and do things differently. It's never too late to change course. And when you're doing something like trying to set up an integrated land use management and resource management planning system, we're treading on new ground. It's kind of an adaptive management process. We have to recognize some things are going to work, some things aren't. And I gave the example of the recovery of the Southern Lakes caribou herd that was almost in extinction in 1991, where 6 First Nations took the lead and said, we're going to manage this herd. We're going to give up our constitutional harvesting rights for as long as it takes for this herd to recover. But we want to be fully involved in the management process. And now they're leading the planning process for the Southern Lakes caribou herd. There's the 6 First Nations, they're entirely in the lead in this process. And it's taken quite a few years to do it. But, for those who know woodland caribou, when you're planning for woodland caribou and woodland caribou habitat, it's all about land use management and land use planning, and a little bit about harvest management. It's all about keeping the habitat intact. So they're doing the land use planning for the Southern Lakes based around the Southern Lakes caribou herd. And now we have 3,000 caribou. After 30 years, we have 3,000 caribou in a semi-urban environment where we had less than 300 30 years ago. So incredible success, and it's led by the First Nations. And so I just want to, I'm an enthusiast. I think we can do better and we can have successes.
I love hearing that, Don. I'm glad you're here. I think I met you the Yukon River panel years back. And I just also, sometimes I hear a lot of like, well, we can't because, we have these blocks from the system. The system is keeping us trapped, and I'm the type of personality of like, well, let's break open the system. Like, we need to change the system. And guess who created the system? People. So we can create a new system. Marina, I love being told no. Yes, Marina, that tells me how to figure out how to make it a yes. Yeah. And I think more and more people are coming forward with that kind of spirit. So that's how we get where we want to go.
And just one more comment. Back in 2017, when as a resource council, we hosted the initial meeting to decide, okay, how are we going to plan for the Southern Lakes caribou? How are we going to develop a plan? And the 6 First Nations said, we need 6 months to organize ourselves to get this process going. And the Yukon government biologists said, well, how are we involved in this? They said, no, we need 6 months to organize ourselves and they actually signed a charter between the 6 First Nations as to how they were going to cooperate and take the lead. And the Yukon biologists said, well, we're the caribou managers, we should be involved in this. And it worked, they took 6 months, actually took 9 months, I think, of discussions and meetings and workshops amongst the First Nations and the resource councils to get a framework together, for doing the planning. So, and again, that was very unusual.
Yeah, it's so awesome to hear those success stories. And I hope we can create more space and time to share them with one another. I think that's really important for us to see that it's possible, and also to hear from those who have undergone changes, like hearing from you about your experience with the Department of Fish and Wildlife over in the Yukon. I know the Yukon Land Use Planning Council, has been undergoing a process to integrate Indigenous knowledge and more equity into their process. And just hearing from these institutions that have made substantial changes or that are undergoing, it's really helpful, I think, for all of us. I can't help but notice there's still a lot of folks who are on, and I personally had an appointment canceled. So if people do want to just stay on and have time to chat more, great, so be it. If you've got to run, you can go, but I'm happy to keep this room open. If I think I'm the host, Carrie, so I can keep this open for a little bit if people want to keep chatting, because this is a great dialogue.
I think what you just said was neat. And it's something that I've been kind of excited about lately, is looking at other success stories and seeing how you could replicate it in your area or in another area. I'm gonna have to move back into the sun for my charger. It's so hot. And that's something that in Southeast, I just recently switched roles. I used to be the CEO for the organized village of Kasan. But when I was over there, something that we were doing is we were entering into an agreement with the Department of Agriculture. And essentially that agreement was kind of a catalyst, one, for funding, but two, also for co-management of USDA lands within our tribal territory. And at first I was thinking, oh, it'd be great to get like all of the tribes together and have these discussions on how we could do this. And I thought, or it was not just me, I will not take all the credit, but we kind of thought, okay, how it's really hard to convene a lot of people for multiple conversations. And so we just had our tribe meet with the Department of Agriculture every single Friday for over a year. We worked out the kinks in this process. And now it's an agreement that we're kind of taking around Southeast Alaska to other tribes and saying, hey, by no means are we trying to tell you what to do in your traditional territory, but this is a lot of hard work that we've done, and it knocked out a lot of the barriers, and you're welcome to take this and change it as you need or enter into a similar agreement with the Department of Agriculture. And so I think, and we just naturally share so much with each other, Indigenous, tribes and entities. I think that it's been great because we're not having to all overtax ourselves by trying to solve every single solution. We're able to help each other out in a way and kind of look to our neighbors and see what they've been up to and what they've done. And in the spirit of knowing that what's best for one area when it comes to sustainability and the health of the environment is really the best thing for the entire globe. So I love like modeling things around and appropriately borrowing knowledge.
I love that phrase, appropriately borrowing knowledge. Yeah, feel for anyone who wants to jump in. I can leave my facilitating role, can just chat. Well, I'll just say, like, I think the more we can share with one another when there are some success stories, to do like what you said, like this is in no way like trying to tell anyone what to do, but just sharing, here's what's working for us, or here's what we're trying to see if it'll work. And the really cool thing about this moment in time is, like, I work for the Northwest Boreal Partnership. We're part of the Northern Latitudes Partnerships. And I'm also, my position is hosted by the Alaska Conservation Foundation. And through all those groups, like, we have seen this huge shift in kind of the mindset and culture of like what people are interested in funding, what they're trying to do to make these systematic, like, or system level changes. What people are interested in learning and coming to the table with. It's just really, I can see this snowballing effect. Even just, like I mentioned, like what funders are interested in putting money towards. There's a lot more interest in supporting tribes and First Nations, and Indigenous leadership, and it's opening up these doors to create so many amazing ways to build like new models for working together. You know, and there's so many different models. So I don't know. This is one reason why I absolutely love my job. Because we get to build bridges, and it's such a cool time right now where things are possible now that really weren't before. And I see our collective mindset shifting, and a lot of healing too. I really love that. Thank you so much, Chiskuk, for bringing up what truth and reconciliation and healing looks like. And I've been really inspired by the Imago initiative that is focused on, you know, it's Indigenous land stewardship, but through and grounded in a model of healing. And a lot of that has been happening in Canada as well. And I really believe we can't do this work unless we incorporate healing as like a ground level, like for framework that we're operating from. And that healing is for everyone, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. My 2 cents.
I think it's really interesting that we're in this time where we're considering traditional and ecological knowledge. And I personally am coming to the realization of that includes listening. And in talking to listening to the last speaker today, he said that TEK includes social innovations, and those things can provide guidance on how we behave. So in thinking about how to incorporate traditional and ecological knowledge in Western land planning, it takes that time to listen. And I think that's where we run up against a brick wall. Is there's always a timeline to meet. You have, so much time to comment on this or that, and we don't have time to listen. So I wonder if we need to rethink about what traditional and ecological knowledge is.
Hey, I just wanted to rephrase, and I think about what it is, or, it's not just the sciences have different ways of doing things, they have a different way of learning. And learning in a more traditional, holistic manner does spend a lot more time listening. But not just for one person. Listen to the land and listen to the health. And it does take longer to learn that kind of science. But you're not thousands of miles away learning it from a book or from a video. So I think that's what I was hearing is, there's a different way of learning in each scientific realm.
I wonder if the process of that learning is being impacted by the timelines that we put on ourselves to meet a certain deadline to try to get something done. If that's just not the right way to go about things, but to actually wait until the process has answered the question.
I think you're exactly right, Jenny. A small example of this is I was at the Board of Fish meeting in March in Anchorage, and the board listened to testimony from fishermen and harvesters and elders for days. And it was the last day in the discussion around herring, where there were going to be some big decisions made around the herring fishery. And there was an Indigenous person who brought into the room, physically brought in herring eggs and held them up. Now, keep in mind, the board was just about to make huge decisions on the herring fishery, huge decisions that would have great impact. And this is one of the last days, one of the very last testimonies that they're listening to. And the Indigenous person handed the herring eggs off so that they could all look at them. This board is supposed to be an expert in these fisheries and they're about to make these decisions, yet they asked, how do we put the eggs onto the branches? After listening for days to testimony, they asked, and I'm not joking, they asked if we glue each egg onto those branches. My 3-year-old nephew could tell you exactly how those eggs get on those branches. It almost is like making me want to cry thinking about it, because these decisions are being made with little to literally no knowledge on our behalf on something that is so precious in the ecosystem out here. I'm looking at the ocean. I'm in Sitka right now, where those eggs came from. And we just had the herring spawn here. And it's incredible to me that these decisions can be made when the knowledge isn't there. And I think that that knowledge needs to be shared far and wide so that we are making proper decisions. Another example is the Forest Service or USDA will be doing tree thinning in the Tongass National Forest so that we grow trees big and fast, while Indigenous people will be the first to tell you that when you grow those trees too big and fast, you have looser rings, so the trees aren't as sturdy. And you also don't have the proper timber that's needed for, like carving a canoe or a totem pole, because the rings are too far apart. And so the USDA has actually been harming the land through this tree thinning method that they've been doing. And now they're asking Indigenous people in our area to start writing these tree thinning prescriptions so that they can fit the ecosystem better.
That's a crazy example of ignorance. Yeah. But you still run into it. And I don't know. Maybe traditional practices seem mysterious or magical or something, but I mean, yeah, traditional knowledge was adapted to be the most practical ways of doing things. And I think I can't imagine anywhere thousands of years ago where somebody was trying to put one egg on a stick. That's crazy.
It's a lot of work, right? For the energy you're trying to get from eating it.
Well, that speaks to what was being said earlier about the education that we receive, what we learn in our lives, and I know so many who are advocating for vast changes in the system that we have in place for how we learn, starting as children on up. And so there's different ways of education that's needed for those who are already in those positions and having the opportunity. And I will say there's a lot of people now who do want to learn and want to know, and there's an opportunity to create ways that then we can help folks get up to speed and be well versed in different ways of knowing, in the two-eyed seeing, and then also working with youth, all youth, right, so that all of our children are growing up with this knowledge. I mean, I have a brand new baby that we are adopting, who's awesome. He's Alaska Native and he's an incredible little spirit. We were so in love. And it sucks that we have to go outside of the current educational system that is going to be provided to him for him to know and learn about who he is, and to learn of that knowledge. And that, I think it's a loss to all people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous.
I agree. And I think Jenny was asking about, or talking about time, and just kind of like, are we making decisions too quickly without having all of the everybody being knowledgeable and things like that. And I think it's so important that while we're getting people up to speed and getting people invested in traditional ways of being, I guess I'll say, I think it's really important that we don't expedite it too much. I know that we need answers today for solutions, but I think we can also slow down a little bit on the extraction that's currently happening so that we can properly educate people. For example, when we're working on fish or at the smokehouse, the kids have different jobs that they learn every single year. They don't learn how to smoke and dry fish by the time that they're 3. They're doing little things around the smokehouse, whether it's cleaning knives or like making sure that the fish are all, a certain way, or grabbing the salt. And while they're doing those things, it's our way of teaching. They're watching in the background and they're learning. My dad never told me a single thing, and he died when I was 20. And when I was 20 is when I took over the smokehouse. And without him physically telling me a single instruction, I was able to carry on our ways of smoking fish. But I think that it's important that we make sure to do this over a length of time so that people become properly invested and learn the knowledge that's needed, instead of taking shortcuts. We can't use Cliff Notes to get to the end of this story. It's really important that I just think that it's really important that we don't expedite it. And for example, I used to give a lot of online, I used to post a lot of like different recipes and harvesting methods for people. And then I actually pulled that all down and I pulled it all back because I had a recipe out there for people to learn how to make vinegar from Devil's Club. But in doing that, I realized that it didn't have all of the work that needs to be done before harvesting the Devil's Club, the mental preparation, the preparation for your body, the intention that's going into it, which the things that I would think are actually 90% of the work, that knowledge I wasn't sharing. And so I didn't want this to become extractive. I wanted to make sure that if anybody was using the knowledge to harvest any of our resources, they were doing it in a good way, with all of the Indigenous knowledge that our people share with us here. And so I think it's going to take a good amount of time before we can properly translate a lot of this knowledge. And starting from childhood is one of the best answers, I think.
Can I send my kiddo Xander down to hang out with you, Marina?
Yep, you can hang out with me and my nephew Xander.
No way.
Yeah.
Were you waving goodbye to you?
Yeah, I was gonna say, and then there are some different tribes that are doing plant harvesting protocol. I worked with Naomi Michelson in the Southeast, and she worked with people that do work with traditional plants from across the state, and we came up with a pretty intense harvesting guideline. And then I made a shorter one. We do plant walks and stuff in the summer, but just, it just has some minimal information, but, we're teaching the rest of it, and teaching people about sharing. And then we don't take people out to do Devil's Club, but I feel like that's definitely something that and I've been working with plants for a long time, but I went to Mullet to learn from an elder down there before I felt comfortable in harvesting. So I appreciate the recognition there, and I'd say if you don't have a plant harvesting protocol in your area, talk to the elders in the tribe, and because I also want to get some of their tribal information put into like a tribal code, so that they have that in the future when anybody tries to say that, oh, no, we don't do that, or we don't use that. So it's good to have it documented, and it's good to recognize that Indigenous knowledge is more than just copying what somebody does. Yeah, it's a lot deeper than that. And I appreciate it.
maybe that's I don't know if that's a good place for it to end, for us to end off. I saw Marina, you held up a booklet. Looks like there's something that was already made in your area though.
Yeah, I actually helped Naomi with what Tia was just talking about. But Naomi just made these really awesome cards, like flashcards, and they're harvesting cards. And on the back of them, it talks about what you're harvesting, and it has preparation for going out. So they're really cool flashcards that we gave out at a potlatch here the other day. And fun for the kids too.
That's super cool.
Yeah.
Yes, also a heart. Thanks for staying on to talk more, guys.
Yeah, this
Love
is great. I gotta go though, unfortunately, but thank you guys so much.
Same here. Hopefully we'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
Take care.
Have an
Good
awesome
night.
night. All right. Bye, everybody. Take care.
Yeah, see you guys. Thanks for sharing.
Bye, Trent.